Hey guys, and welcome to lecture 1 of AP Euro. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the Calamitous 14th century. This is a phrase that I'm borrowing from the venerable historian Barbara Tuchman, who wrote a comprehensive account of this time period and gave a whole bunch of really amazing gory details, some of which I'll be sharing with you in this lecture. And so we're going to be looking at a number of really serious crises that strike Europe during the 1300s, and talking about how these crises help to shake up the medieval status quo and play a role in bringing about the beginning of the Renaissance and Europe's move towards modernity. But before we move on, let's take a moment to appreciate this wonderfully grotesque painting by Peter Bruegel called The Triumph of Death. This is painted in the 1500s, but I think that this painting does an excellent job of capturing just some of the brutal imagery that would have been familiar to folks living in the 1300s. We'll look at some artwork from the 1300s that is actually quite similar to Bruegel's artwork here. Some of my particular favorites are the skeleton stuffing food into a dead person's mouth, and a skeleton riding a emaciated horse with a sickle. Also, them herding all these peasants into a box that doesn't seem to go anywhere. But anyway, great, terrible painting. But anyway, let's move on and start talking about some terrible things. So the main things that we're going to be looking at, the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and the Great Schism. But basically, things get off to a terrible start around the year 1300. Even before any of these famous catastrophes, just with widespread famine. During the Middle Ages, up to around 1300, Europe's population has been steadily increasing. This has to do with more stable government, some improvements to agricultural technology, better plows, windmills, water mills, stuff like that. Also, some relative peace on the European continent with the end of the Viking invasions and a lot of the knights going off to the Holy Land to kill people there rather than killing each other. So all of this contributed to steady population growth up until around 1300. And around 1300, historians argue that Europe was reaching basically its carrying capacity. All of the best land was already being farmed, and Europeans were now starting to attempt to farm swampy areas, hillsides, clearing forests in order to plow more land, which then led to shortages of fuel and other important products that came from the forest. And so Europe was basically pushing up against the total population limit that they could support at that time. And so you started to see widespread famines throughout Europe. This was made worse by the fact that transportation in the 1300s was still incredibly primitive. So even if there was a solid harvest in one region, a lot of that food could not be exported to another region simply because transport was so expensive. And so a lot of historians argue that this famine was kind of a background problem that helps to explain some of the other stuff, especially the Black Death, because people's immune systems are far weaker when they're also suffering from malnutrition. But so anyway, we're going to move on now to talk about the Black Death, and then we'll also talk about these other awful things in a minute. So I know a lot of you guys are probably already familiar with the Black Death. It's one of my favorite topics, but let's just do a quick review of some of the basic facts. So the Black Death hits Europe in 1346. This is part of a Eurasian-wide pandemic, right? Maybe it's not a pandemic, an epidemic, that started in Central Asia and is connected possibly with the Mongol invasions and increased trade between Europe and Asia. China also gets wrecked by the Black Death. And it leads to worldwide deaths somewhere between 75 and 200 million. That range is so wide just because record keeping at the time was pretty hit or miss. There's also a substantial debate about how many people within Europe died. And the range is quite wide. At the most conservative end, historians estimate about 30% of the population died, whereas some more recent historians have argued that it's possible that more than half of the European population died during this time period. Regardless, though, the death rates are just totally staggering. And in a way, I'm surprised that society didn't collapse entirely. Imagine how well would our society function if half of the people died over the course of 4 years. I really can't see it working out. The death rates were so staggering that normal ways of dealing with dead bodies were no longer sufficient. They had to resort to mass graves in order just to get the bodies out. And in some cases, bodies weren't even buried and were simply nailed up in the houses where they died because people were afraid to actually go in and take care of the problem. There is some social breakdown reported. Giovanni Boccaccio, who is one of our best sources on the Black Death, points out that, and you can see in that quote there, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but he points out that it basically became impossible to hire people to care for the sick. And if you did end up hiring somebody to care for the sick, they would charge you exorbitant rates. And in most cases, it still wasn't worth it because the odds of you getting sick from simply being in the sick person's house was so high. So anyway, that's just a quick intro to the Black Death. We don't need to get into all the specific details about, its causes and whatnot. The main thing I want to talk about is the effects of the Black Death. So what happens to a society where half of the population dies for a totally unknown reason, a totally inexplicable cause? And well, I'll tell you. First of all, take a minute and just appreciate this insane graph. I know the scale's messed up here. It says 80 and 90 are swapped, but don't worry about that. So you'll see a steady rise of the European population up to right around 90 million people living on the European continent, and then it just drops straight down. And the population levels will not recover until the middle of the 1500s. And so what happens to a society when a big chunk of the adult population just disappears? Well, there's a number of important impacts, and the most easily documented are economic impacts. So what happens is you see a decrease in the labor supply. Before the Black Death, there were too many people and not enough land. And so the landowners were able to hire workers to work that land at incredibly low rates, basically starvation rates, which is one of the reasons famine was such a problem. And so with the loss of a big chunk of the population, the survivors are now able to sell their labor more dearly. So peasants are now in a position for the first time in centuries where they can actually negotiate with their landlords. And if the peasants aren't happy with the deal that their traditional landlord is giving them, they know that there are other landlords nearby who are also looking for farm workers. And so this leads to, in many cases, a rise in peasant labor costs, which is very good for the working classes of Europe and is not such a great thing for the feudal elites. They now have to pay more just to get their fields plowed and sowed and harvested. One way that some feudal elites respond to this is by trying to pass laws that enforce economic inequality. For example, in some parts of France, they pass laws about the maximum rate at which peasants may be paid, basically trying to suppress wages back down to their pre-plague levels. Naturally, this leads to massive unrest among the peasants. Another thing that happens on top of that is you also see the rise or the concentration of wealth among the surviving elites. So landowners, usually the wealthy aristocrats, if half of a noble family dies, all of the land that is left by those dead people will end up in the hands of a smaller number of heirs. So you see the concentration of land into larger holdings, which leads to the rise of some very powerful aristocratic families. And in some cases, this can even lead to more powerful kings, because if a noble family dies out entirely and there is no legal heir, the king, in many cases, is able to claim that land for himself. All right, so those are the economic impacts. The most important one is that peasants get paid more and they have higher expectations for the future. There's also some interesting cultural impacts. Of course, cultural impacts are always harder to document. But one really important fact is that there is disagreement among leaders in Europe about what caused the Black Death. The most obvious explanation is that God is angry at Europe for its sins, and that Europeans need to repent in order to get God to stop. Europeans flock to churches, they flagellate themselves in the street to make up for the bad deeds of others. None of this works. Scientists, quote unquote, the scholars at the University of Paris and other universities around Europe, come up with a wacky explanation in which they argue that a certain arrangement of the planets has led to the eruption of deadly gases on Earth. This is known as the miasma theory. And that these gases are like rolling around Earth, causing the Black Death. And some local communities come to the conclusion that the Black Death is being caused by Jews, and they go on to ransack the local Jewish communities nearby. Of course, none of these explanations leads to any sort of effective cure or containment of the disease, which could contribute to a delegitimization of existing intellectual and religious elites. It also seems to lead, at least among some communities, to a sort of like carpe diem secular attitude. We definitely see this in Renaissance Italy. Remember, one of our best sources is the Renaissance poet Giovanni Boccaccio. And he's writing right at kind of the very beginning of the Florentine Renaissance. And seeing how death could just show up at any moment and take away everything that you have seems to motivate some people just to try and enjoy the time that they've got on Earth. Of course, you could also imagine a kind of opposite reaction where the fact that death is just around the corner might make you more religious. But it seems in some cases to have led folks to a more secular attitude towards life. This is some cool art that became popular during the time period. This theme of skeletons or zombies dancing around with rich, important folks is known as the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death. And it became a popular theme kind of all over the place in the 14th and 15th century as the plague raged around in Europe. So that's the Black Death. Now, while the Black Death is going on, at the same time that the 100 Years' War occurs in Europe. And when I say in Europe, I mean in France, basically. But so keep in mind that the Black Death is going to be happening at the same time as this conflict. So what's the 100 Years' War? Well, first of all, you'll notice that it lasts more than 100 years. But I guess like the 114-year war just isn't as good of a name. So we just rounded down to 100 years. But so what happens here? All right, so the 100 Years' War begins over a legal technicality in which the English king legally inherits the French throne. And so this goes all the way back to the fact that England was originally, the Kingdom of England was founded by a French nobleman, a guy named William the Conqueror, who was a knight from Normandy in northern France. So William the Conqueror goes in and conquers England, and the kings of England continue to retain holdings in France and are actually legally connected to the King of France. Also, they marry into the French royal family at various points, and so the English king is, weirdly enough, in the line of succession for the French king. And so in 1337, or around then, I don't remember exactly when this happens, the French king dies, and he doesn't have a son. So they trace back in the family line looking for who the next closest relative to the king is, and it turns out to be the King of England. And all of the French nobles, when they hear that, basically just say, nope, no way. We are not going to allow an Englishman to rule France. And so the French nobility just support another distant relative of the king to become the new king instead. Now, the English king's not just going to let this slide. He wants to be king of France, which is by far the wealthiest and most powerful kingdom in medieval Europe. Unfortunately, England isn't actually wealthy or powerful enough to conquer France. So what happens is you just get a series of English invasions where the English roll into France, burn down a bunch of stuff, and actually continually beat armies of French knights. But they don't have enough men or resources to actually conquer France. So England keeps winning battles, but they can't hold on to the country. So they basically hope that if they just continually invade and smack France over and over again, the French nobles will give up and eventually declare the English king king of France. This doesn't work. So basically, the English just keep invading France and keep sacking the countryside and bringing stuff back to England until they eventually get beat. The end of the war is fun and kind of mythologized. There's a girl, I think she's like 12 or something, who is seeing religious visions. Her name is Joan d'Arc. And she is able to rally the completely demoralized French knights to fight the English once again. Under her leadership, the French knights are able to actually beat the English and force the English to stop attacking France. The war isn't ever really officially ended, and English kings will continue to claim the title of King of France for the next 100 years. Another thing that helps during this time period is the French start using cannons, which makes it much easier to take back territory conquered by the English. But there's some important stuff that happens during the 100 Years' War. So even though ultimately the English just get stomped and get kicked out of France, some very important changes occur over this 100-year conflict. First of all, England is able to consistently beat French armies. And they are able to do so by adopting a number of military innovations. The French are very, very traditional. They rely on armies composed basically entirely of heavily armored knights. These are, big aristocrats who have trained their whole lives, who are wearing like $50,000 or $100,000 suits of armor, or whatever the equivalent currency would have been back then, who line up in a big line and charge forward for manly combat, hand to hand. The English are relying on a number of new tactics in which they are employing common foot soldiers. And these tactics that the English develop consistently defeat the French knights. What's going on here? So most importantly, the English make use of pikemen and longbowmen. That is, dudes with pointy sticks and dudes with huge bows, bows that have like over 120 pounds of resistance. So you have to be like a pretty strong guy just to pull the thing back. But these things can then fire huge arrows over like hundreds of yards that can kill a horse or penetrate through certain types of armor. And so what happens is the English are able to take up a defensive position. They have a whole bunch of guys that they're paying like pennies a day, line up in a big square, and then they just rain arrows down on the French knights who fall off their horses and then get, knifed in the mud. So the rise of commoners is a huge problem for the feudal system because the feudal system is centered around creating a consistent supply of elite knights. But if these elite knights can lose to an army of peasant soldiers, what is the purpose? What is their purpose in life if they can just go down to a farmer with a longbow? And so this is going to kind of shake the very foundations of the European political structure. Because if the knights are no longer good at fighting, the question is, what are they good for and why should the king keep them around? This is only going to get worse with the rise of gunpowder weapons. Because whereas a longbow can punch through most forms of armor, a musket can just blow right through even the finest breastplates. So anyway, now, one last thing. The 100 Years' War lasts 100 years. And this means that traditional feudal armies aren't going to cut it anymore. Traditional feudal armies show up for, like, the summer. They fight for free for a couple months, and then they have to go home. These guys all have lands back home where they have to, run the show. What this means is that in order to keep the war going, both sides are going to need to start to hire professional soldiers. And these guys are mercenaries. So what this means is that warfare shifts from being free and short-term to being kind of long-term and extremely expensive. So kings, in order to be able to fight wars effectively going forward, are going to need massive amounts of money. And this is going to be a major theme in the first part of the class. Kings during the early modern period are going to be desperate to get money in basically any way that they can. Because if you don't have money, you can't keep mercenaries in the field. And if you can't keep mercenaries in the field, you are going to get conquered. So that's the military significance of the 100 Years' War. And it's going to lead to kings trying to centralize their authority and increase taxes. And all of this is going to come at the expense of the traditional feudal nobility. A third crisis that's going on during this time is a wave of commoners revolting. And this is both going to be peasant revolts and also unrest within the cities and unrest between cities and traditional feudal elites. So the unrest comes from pretty obvious reasons. There's not a lot of food. There's lots of armies marching back and forth, stealing what little food there is from the peasants, rising taxes to pay for war, and of course the Black Death. So all of this leads to a lot of people to think that now's the time for rapid social change. So there's a lot of peasant rebellions. There's a major one in France called the Jacquerie, and another major one led by a guy named John Ball in England. These both fail totally. There's a revolt in the city of Florence in which the poor workers who work in the cloth industry, known as the Ciompi, take over the government of Florence for about 4 years before being overthrown. And there's also a number of cases in which independent towns go up against feudal lords, and these guys win. So we're going to look a little bit at each one of these. So first, let's talk about peasant revolts. And let me just say, first of all, guys, if you ever have the opportunity to join a peasant revolt, don't do it. Peasant revolts almost entirely fail. And during the Middle Ages, they fail every single time. But so let's talk about it. Peasants are usually very, very conservative. They simply do things the way they've always been done, and any change away from the status quo for the peasants is usually viewed as a bad thing. And it might just be because usually when things change, they are bad for the peasants, like taxes go up or traditional privileges get taken away and stuff like that. A second thing is that the peasants will pretty much always justify their revolt using religious terms, but they're not actually usually upset about religious stuff. They're usually upset about bread and butter issues, because remember, the peasants live on the edge of starvation. So any change could potentially mean the death of one of their children, or, the starvation of their entire family. Now, why do peasants lose every time? Well, there's a number of problems. First of all, if you're a peasant, it's very hard to organize a large group of peasants. Transportation is incredibly slow. Literacy is basically non-existent. So the word of the revolt has to spread by word of mouth. Usually also, the peasants don't really have any training, and they don't really have any clear goals. It's not like they have a strategy. They're just going to basically kill as many knights as they can until they get what they want. But, how does that work exactly? And last of all, they are facing military experts. The feudal landlords that the peasants are rebelling against have spent their whole lives preparing for warfare. Also, the feudal classes will always work together to crush peasant revolts. So if one noble lord has a revolt on his land, he will immediately send out messengers to nearby nobles to assemble their guys, and they will all strap on their armor and wade out and just slay these peasants. And it's usually just a total massacre. A couple hundred knights in full armor could just totally roll through even a mass of thousands of peasants. And so it's not even close. So don't join a peasant revolt. Sorry, guys. Now, here's a picture of a peasant revolt and a very weird horse. The leader of the peasant revolt in England, or the most important peasant revolt in England, was a guy named John Ball. And the slogan for this peasant revolt was, I think, actually pretty catchy. They ask, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman?" So you'll see here the peasants are using religious ideas to justify the revolt. And basically they're saying that any sort of inequality is unfair because when humanity was created, everybody worked. Adam and Eve were not nobles. Adam and Eve were peasants. So anyway, I think that's an interesting idea. They're basically like communists, kind of. So anyway, now, on the other hand, there are a number of very significant revolts of cities against the nobility, and these work. We see this in the Swiss Confederacy. We see this in Italy, and we see this in a number of German cities as well. And the cities, unlike the peasants, stand a chance. First of all, the cities are increasingly wealthy, and this gives them time to train and to organize. And it also gives them the ability to buy first-rate military equipment. And so cities are actually capable of equipping their people with fancy arms and armor. Also, on top of that, very often cities are actually able to ally with kings because the kings are starting to realize that they might actually need the cities more than they need the nobles, especially as warfare continues to change and as common armies continue to trounce knights over in France. Rulers are seeing more and more that actually the cities, with their trade and their commerce and their craftsmanship, might be more useful to them than a bunch of knights. And so kings are willing to make deals with the cities. So here's some images of what this might have looked like. This is an image of a Swiss team of pikemen taking on a army of Burgundian knights. And unlike what you've seen in movies, horses aren't stupid, and horses will not simply impale themselves on a row of spikes. So if you and your buddies can get together with pointy sticks and just stay there and stay in a nice tight block with the spears and nobody runs away, you're actually pretty much safe against the knight's main number one move. And the Swiss figure this out, and pretty soon other cities start to copy them. Here is a German mercenary, somebody who would have fought for different cities in Germany. And German mercenaries known as Landesknecht were actually allowed to, they were given special exemptions to certain laws that allowed them to wear as much silk and velvet as they wanted to, and they kind of went totally overboard there. But hey, if you're fighting on the front lines of a bunch of battles, you might as well, spend your money while you can on big fancy clothes. So anyway, I definitely want a shirt like that. But so anyway, that's the 100-year. That's the revolt of the masses, and our last big crisis that we've got to look at is the Great Schism, in which there will be 2, and for a couple of years, 3 popes. I'm going to try and cover this quick because I know we're already at 30 minutes, but let's see what we can do. So the crisis starts in the early 1300s, basically at the very beginning of the time period we're looking at, in which a powerful French king, a guy named Philip the Fair, wants to tax the church. He says, he basically says the church owns lots of land on my territory. I ought to be able to tax them just like I tax everybody else. And the Pope is totally against this. Philip the Fair, in order to try and, in an attempt to get what he wants, accuses the Pope of heresy. Now, obviously, it's probably not going to work, right? The Pope gets to decide who's a heretic, not the King of France. And so the Pope, a guy named Boniface, issues one of the most famous papal bulls in European history, and that is Unum Sanctum. And the papal bull of Unum Sanctum argues that the Pope is the supreme leader of Christendom, both spiritually and politically. That basically all the rulers of Europe have to listen to the Pope when it comes down to it. And Boniface, on top of that, prepares to issue a bull of excommunication against Philip the Fair. In order to prevent this, Philip the Fair sends some of his guys down to Italy and arrests Boniface. Boniface is held in captivity for a short period of time before being freed, partially by an angry mob of Italians. But Boniface apparently was not treated quite well, and he dies soon thereafter without ever being able to excommunicate Philip. There is a lot of wrangling over who the next pope is going to be, but it ultimately ends up as a French guy, a guy named Clement V. And Clement V forgives Philip the Fair for what he did to Boniface, and gives Philip the Fair basically everything he wants. On top of that, Clement moves the papacy from Rome to the city of Avignon. Avignon is right here. It's in France today, but back then it was a papal territory right on the border of France. And there's a big old bridge that connects Avignon to France, which is just on the other side of the river. The French king maintains an army right next to Avignon, and it turns out that as long as the papacy stays in Avignon, only Frenchmen are elected to the papacy. On top of that, the papacy for the next 70 years pursues a pro-French policy. They let the French tax people, they sign marriage, they let the French kings marry whoever they want, stuff like that. They also allow the French king to dissolve one of the oldest and most important knightly orders, the Knights Templar. Philip the Fair accuses them of witchcraft and sodomy, and then confiscates their huge reserves of wealth and destroys the order basically entirely. On top of that, the Avignon papacy is pretty unpopular, not just because they're playing favorites with France, but also because they live in an incredibly luxurious manner and seem to be spending a lot of their money on worldly pleasures rather than on, spreading the ideas of Christendom. During this time period, there's a number of major heretical movements. In England, a guy named John Wycliffe starts to argue that the Bible should be translated into English, and a number of other heretical ideas. And William of Ockham comes up with a number of crazy ideas that I don't want to get into right now. One of them is that God is ultimately unknowable because he is infinite and the human mind is finite. He's also the guy who comes up with the idea of Occam's razor. But so anyway, when we talk about the popes living in a princely fashion, it's worth looking at the papal palace. The papal palace is constructed in the most modern Gothic style at the time, and it looks more like a castle than a church. This is capable of being defended if it ever comes under siege. It's a very cool structure, but it doesn't really send the message that the Pope is like the spiritual head of Christendom. It kind of makes the Pope look like he's a prince, possibly even a vassal of the King of France. But so anyway, it's clear that the Avignon papacy is damaging the reputation of the Catholic Church. And eventually, a guy named Gregory, even though he's a Frenchman, decides that for the good of Christendom, he is going to return the papacy to Rome. And the kings of France are like, no, you don't have to go. It's fine. But he decides to go. And so he gets his followers and he travels down to Rome. When he gets to Rome, he immediately starts a war with Florence and then dies. So the Pope and all his cardinals are now in Rome, and they are surrounded. A mob of angry Italians surrounds the papal palace in the Vatican, and they start chanting for an Italian. And they basically say either we're getting an Italian pope or you're all dead. And so guess what? The French cardinals elect a random Italian guy to be the next pope, a guy named Urban VI. And so the Italian mob dissipates. Urban VI becomes the next pope. But all of the French cardinals then run away back to Avignon, declare the new pope, or the pope that they just elected, fake, and they argue that they were forced to, and that doesn't count. And then they vote and make another guy pope, and this guy is Clement VI. And they so now there are two popes. There's an Italian pope and a French pope, and both popes immediately call the other pope the Antichrist. So things basically just go from bad to worse in terms of public relations for the Catholic Church. Instead of the Pope just being a stooge of the King of France, there's now two popes, and one of them might be the devil. So this is a huge problem, because remember, if you're not a part of the church, you go to hell. But now there are two churches, and each church is saying that the other church is false. So that means there's basically a 50-50 chance that you're going to go to hell for no reason other than the Catholic Church can't get its act together. So this leads to a number of other problems besides that. First of all, taxes go up because now you have two different church bureaucracies, each trying to do the job of the Catholic Church. So there's more taxes, it's more expensive. There's increasing levels of corruption. During this time period, it's more or less totally normal for priests and bishops to be married and to have kids openly. Or even if they don't get married, they'll just have concubines that live with them as if they were married, on top of all sorts of other stuff. So Europe basically splits down the middle on who they support. So obviously France supports the French Pope, and the people in Rome support the Italian Pope. And everybody else kind of splits. And it basically just depends on how do you feel about France. So England supports the Italian Pope, Spain, or Castile and Aragon support the French, the French Pope. Scotland supports the French Pope because Scotland has always liked France because France doesn't like England and Scotland doesn't like England. But so anyway, Europe splits down the middle. It's clear that this can't last. the Catholic Church will tear itself apart and cease to have the central spiritual role that it has had if this continues. And so a number of people begin to call for some kind of resolution. The main movement is known as the conciliarist movement, and they basically are just scholars from all over Christendom saying that the two sides need to reconcile their differences. Jan Hus is a guy from Bohemia over here in the Holy Roman Empire, and he's going to issue a number of really important critiques of the papacy. One of the main things that he's going to critique is this practice of indulgences, in which the popes offer essentially tickets out of purgatory in order to raise money. And both sides have been doing this more frequently now because of the increasing financial burden brought about by having two separate papal courts. That's going to be important later on when we look at the Protestant Reformation. But so eventually this crisis is resolved. It doesn't get resolved until 1415, but the conciliarist movement gains in strength until pretty much everybody can agree that the popes need to go and that we need to figure this out. So they have a first meeting where the emperor and the king of France and all the other bigwigs from all over the place get together, and they elect a new pope. But both of the old popes refuse to recognize it, so then we have three popes. And so that's just made it worse. But then they have another council, and they really do get everybody on board, and they're able to convince both popes to give up their power, or all three of the popes to give up power. And they elect a brand new, fresh, clean pope, a guy named Martin V. They reaffirm They affirm the idea that the supreme authority in the church is not the Pope, but rather church councils. And Martin V, when he's there at Constance, says, yeah, we'll do it, no problem. The council is really where it comes from. The Pope just is like the enforcer. But as soon as he gets back to Rome, Martin V basically starts acting like an old school pope and acting essentially as an absolute monarch ruling over the church. Now, last thing that they do at the Council of Constance to seal the deal is they burn Jan Hus to death for his criticism of the papacy. So even though they couldn't agree on who should have been pope for a long time, everybody can now agree that Jan Hus has gone too far and that he shouldn't be criticizing the church's ability to raise taxes and stuff like that. So Jan Hus is killed and he becomes a martyr who is going to become popular in the next century with the Protestant Reformation. They'll look back to Jan Hus and argue that a lot of the changes that they're making in the 1500s should have been made back in the 1400s when Jan Hus brought up these problems. So anyway, if we look at the big impact of the papal schism, there's a number of pretty obvious outcomes. First of all, the papacy loses a lot of prestige, and there's a lot more heresy in Europe than there used to be. So there's the conciliarists who say that church councils have total authority, not the Pope. There's the Lollards who followed John Wycliffe and who are secretly translating the Bible into English. There's the followers of Jan Hus who still are quite powerful in Bohemia, who are arguing against the church's ability to raise taxes and other stuff. There's also increased practices of corruption within the church, the increased use of indulgences to raise money, the selling of church offices, something known as simony, and just general extravagance, spending a lot of the church money on like fancy slippers and stuff like that. In many ways, this is a major turning point in European intellectual history and represents kind of the beginning of the end of the church as a dominant cultural force in Europe. And so in the next unit, we're going to see Renaissance humanism and Protestantism both challenging the church's claim to be sort of the central focus of European life. This image is just from a Martin Luther insult generator. Luther's insults against the Pope are epic. You can just Google Luther insult generator if you'd like to be insulted by Martin Luther. There's thousands of them. this one's one of my particular favorites. But so anyway, that's basically it. So famine, disease, war, peasant revolts, and a collapse of the religious order. So I would like for you guys to take a minute and think about how all of this stacked up is going to challenge the traditional feudal order in which the church and the nobility are on top and everybody else is supposed to just kind of quietly farm and meet and pay taxes. It's not going to stay that way, and all of this helps to bring about kind of the next phase in European social development, which we're going to talk about later. If you want to know more about any of this stuff, I do highly recommend the book A Distant Mirror. You can probably get a used copy for like $5 on Amazon. It's super fun. You can read about all the insane movements that people joined to try and fight the Black Death and all of the ridiculous knightly behavior that happens during the 100 Years' War. But yeah, so anyway, so 45 minutes. It's a pretty long lecture, but we did cover a lot of stuff. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope that you weren't too bored or distracted during this lecture. If you were, let me know, and I'll try and spice it up. All right, thanks guys, bye.